James O'Brien. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
12:36 is the time. That this story will, I suspect, unless something extraordinary happens, continue to dominate both the news agenda and our conversations. A quick word, actually I'll tell you a bit later, because Simon Marks is on the line from Washington DC, and it is UK politics for once that is, although it's UK-US politics, isn't it, really, with regard to Mandelson and Starmer. But I want to begin with some very grim developments in an area that you and I have been talking about for rather longer than most people, and that is Donald Trump's designs upon democracy itself. And that's no exaggeration, Simon.
It is no exaggeration at all, James. We have seen in the last couple of days, Donald Trump absolutely upping the ante in his threat to disrupt the midterm elections that are going to take place in exactly 9 months' time here in the United States. Critical elections that will determine the balance of power in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Also elections for 36 gubernatorial mansions all over the country. And as you and I have observed over the last several weeks, President Trump has been percolating away in the back of his mind thoughts about the elections. On 2 occasions, he has told reporters he doesn't even think that the midterms should be taking place. The White House falsely described those comments as facetious. He was just joking. Then earlier in the week, in a podcast interview, out of nowhere, he suddenly started talking about federalizing the elections and saying that 15 Republican states, didn't identify them, but all governed by Republicans, should hand the authority to administer their elections over to Washington. It was a very muddled claim that the president was advancing in that podcast. The White House waved it off. They said he didn't mean anything by it. He just meant to say that what he wants to do is back a piece of legislation being debated on Capitol Hill that, when it's passed, would require voters to present identification at the polling station before they cast their ballots. The president did not mention that legislation at all in that podcast interview. And then yesterday, after those White House efforts to wave reporters off the scent, he returned to the subject and went into much more detail as he continued to undermine public integrity, making entirely false claims about the sanctity of America's elections, so presented the public with a problem that doesn't exist, and also presented the public with his fix for it.
You think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. But when you see some of these states about how horribly they run their elections, what a disgrace it is, I think the federal government, when you see crooked elections, and we had plenty of them, and by the way, we had them last time, but go to 2020 and look at the facts that are coming out. Rigged, crooked elections, and the federal government should not allow that. The federal government should get involved. These are agents of the federal government to count the votes. If they can't count the votes legally and honestly, then somebody else should take over.
Wow.
This is a supercharged effort by the president to undermine public integrity in the country's elections and to propose planned efforts to combat issues that don't exist with America's elections with measures that are plainly unconstitutional. This is an assault not just on election integrity, but now an assault on the Constitution. When he says that those people who count the votes in America's 50 states, and we should remind everybody, we don't have nationally administered elections here. The Constitution says it falls to each of America's 50 states to run their own elections. When he says that those people counting the votes are agents of the federal government, that is completely false. But what he's proposing to do is to have the federal government, led by him, oversee America's midterm elections this November. And how the White House is going to explain all that away in the hours ahead is going to be intriguing to watch.
So ignorance of history, US history, ignorance of the Constitution and ignorance of the most basic facts. But the days when those things seem to matter in these kind of conversations have long since passed, Simon. Who can resist this? Because, I mean, the reason I chuckled, as you probably know, is because we've heard this defence before with, he's only talking about it, don't worry about what he says, worry about what he does. But, spoiler alert, he then goes and does it. Unless, of course, as we saw most recently with Greenland, there is sufficient pushback and resistance to make him run away for now with his tail between his legs. So who pushes back on this, and what does pushback look like?
Well, the Constitution pushes back on this because what he's proposing is flatly unconstitutional, and I think even a Supreme Court with a 6-3 built-in majority for the Republican Party and for Donald Trump's sort of more conservative viewpoints would find it very, very difficult to find any legal basis to allow him to do this. We did see the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, again earlier in the week, waving all this off and saying, no, there's not going to be any change to America's electoral system. But he is now like a dog with a bone. And there is another reason why he is articulating all of this, because when November rolls around, if elections are administered in time-honoured fashion by America's 50 states, and when Republicans find themselves losing control of the House of the Representatives and or the Senate, Donald Trump is going to be in a position where he will say, I told you so, the fix was in, these elections were rigged, just like the 2020 election was rigged. He's talking again about prosecutions taking place in Georgia following that extremely serious FBI raid on a Georgia election storage unit last week, when the FBI carted off 700 boxes of votes and Georgia's electoral register, the list of all its voters, their names, where they live, all of that now in the Department of Justice's possession. He is positioning himself to argue that for 9 months prior to the midterm elections, he has been warning Americans that you can't trust America's election system. So even if he doesn't get to make the changes that he's proposing, and I don't see any legislative path forward for him to do that currently, even if he doesn't get to make them, he will still advance the argument that the country needs to disavow midterm election results if they don't show he wins. Remember, he only likes the outcome of elections and doesn't grouse about them when he wins them.
Because, of course, the system that delivered him victory at the most recent election was exactly the same as the system that delivered defeat in 2020.
Correct.
But these are precisely the sort of details that Donald Trump has no time or space for, and that journalists admitted into the Oval Office wouldn't be permitted to raise anymore. So I'm optimistic and pessimistic about your analysis. I'll take your bet that the system will resist any actual attempts to undermine it, but the victim narrative, which is intrinsic, of course, to Donald Trump personally and to any fascist project politically, the victimhood narrative will be that they've stolen it from us. What's the polling on 2020? Do people still believe that? I mean, he still contends that it was stolen from him, but everybody up to and including Fox News knows that that's a blatant lie. Fox News ended up on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars as a consequence of going along with it for a while.
Yes, that is correct, as did other media organisations here, including Newsmax, the other sort of major right-leaning news channel here in the United States. But for Donald Trump's Make America Great Again supporters, they absolutely, in large numbers, buy the notion that the electoral system is rigged. And I think that when you see events like that FBI raid last week, it does lead Americans across the dinner table to say, well, hang on a minute. I mean, is there something there? Just the idea that you keep this constantly warm, you keep it constantly simmering away, and you never stop talking about it. And given that FBI raid, I mean, even the head of elections, the head of the Elections Commission in Georgia says that he now expects to be arrested, even though he plainly has done nothing wrong, given the politicisation of the FBI, the peer piercing of the independence of the Department of Justice, I think really the incineration of the independence of the Department of Justice, turned into the Office of Personal Retribution for Donald Trump, there will be Americans, if arrests are made, who say, well, you know, maybe there is something there. We should see what happens at the trial. Let's see where all of this goes. It's deliberate strategy to undermine integrity that may still exist, even in pockets of his own support base in the election, in the electoral system.
And finally, I appreciate you've answered this in part, but is there any prospect of any significant Republicans objecting to this direction of traffic?
Yeah, well, I think absolutely, because the Republican Party, remember, James, is the party of states' rights. It's the party that traditionally has always said national government needs to play a much smaller role in society. The states can do things themselves. And remember, even Donald Trump's administration says that, for example, about the issue of schooling. He's currently dismantling and planning to close the Department of Education, essentially the Ministry of Education at a federal level here in Washington, D.C., because he argues that government has no right telling individual states what curriculum to teach, what books should be allowed or banned in classrooms. The entire organisation of educational systems within schooling, he says, should go to the states. But with elections, everything he's arguing needs to come to Washington, D.C. to oversee. So there will be many, many Republicans who don't want to touch this with a barge pole, and also Republicans who have taken an oath, as the president has done, to uphold the American Constitution. And the Constitution in black and white is implacably clear on this issue.
It's an article of faith, I always thought, when I was doing my politics A-level, for the sort of interdependence and independence of each individual state. We're short of time, and I've got quite an important guest coming up after the next break. But a quick word, if you would, on Epstein. And obviously we're talking about little else over here. How heavily have the latest releases landed over there?
Oh, they've landed very heavily here. I mean, obviously not so much as far as Peter Mandelson is concerned, although he's certainly getting a mention both on television and in the major newspapers here. Only yesterday, his successor, Christian Turner, the new British ambassador to the United States, presented his credentials to State Department officials, so he's now in the driving seat at the embassy. The big date in the diary coming up here, February the 26th, Hillary Clinton, and February the 27th, Bill Clinton, have both now they've abandoned their efforts to refuse to testify. They are both going to give depositions that will be taped and transcribed to the House Oversight Committee about what they knew of Jeffrey Epstein. President Trump is claiming that he's been absolved by last Friday's documents release, and indeed most of the attention is focused on other people. But there are still huge questions about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein that are not answered, but raised by some of the documents that we saw last Friday.
And huge numbers of documents that still haven't been released, despite the legal requirement to do so. Simon Marks, thank you so much. What day is it? Wednesday. I suspect we'll talk before the end of the week. I certainly hope so.